I came across The Punisher, A Man Named Frank late into my collecting for this string of episodes. I was researching the Gunhawks for Blaze of Glory, which led me to the 80th anniversary one-shot, and in reading the information page at the very end of that book, written by Brian Overton, he mentions A Man Named Frank. Now, I hadn't seen this. I didn't know anything about this book. What was A Man Named Frank? I did a quick look up on mycomicshop.com, and sure enough, there was a graphic novel published in 1994. They didn't have a copy available, so I switched over to eBay and did a search there. There were 3 or 4 of them listed for about $20 each, plus shipping. And here's where I went, I'm a pass. $25 is a decent amount of money for one comic book, and I'm not a very big Punisher fan, and my adventure through Marvel's West was focused on its Western characters, not on the reimagining of existing characters as Westerns. I mean, I know what that story looks like. Frank Castle's family gets murdered, he murders the guys who do it, but now with 6 shooters and horses in a desert setting instead of New York City. Big deal, who cares? To the book's credit, though, if there was any modern character that I think would adapt perfectly well to the American West, it would be the Punisher. And it was written by Chuck Dixon, who was a great writer in general, but specifically a solid Punisher writer. I didn't buy any of his run, but Dixon wrote over 50 issues of the Punisher's various ongoing series between 1991 and 95, including another graphic novel called Kingdom Gone. This is a man who knows the Punisher. Secondly, it was drawn by John Buscema. As a 90s-era reader, I don't have much experience with Buscema's artwork, I'll admit that. He was very prolific in the 60s and 70s, but did a huge library of work over the course of his life. He drew over 100 issues of Conan the Barbarian when Marvel got the license to it, and then continued to work with and be associated with Conan for the next 14 years. Of import to this particular episode of Breakdown, though, Buscema drew a handful of issues of Punisher Warzone, working with author Chuck Dixon. Fun fact, Buscema was the artist who drew the Punisher-related portions of the Punisher Meets Archie comic. Buscema is an artist whose interpretation of the Punisher is so iconically the Punisher that he was the artist chosen to render him in that intercompany crossover. So again, we have someone who excels at what they do teamed up with an author who excels at what they do on a character that they are both very familiar with. These 2 bits of general interest kept me checking eBay, and each time that I checked, the available copies of A Man Named Frank shrank, many of them getting CGC'd and sealed away in plastic, never to be read again. That meant that the price on the existing copies went up, creeping to $30, then $35, then $40, $45, or $50. As of writing this, like right this moment, the cheapest copy I can find on eBay is $30 plus $6 shipping, so the price is maintained pretty solidly. But I got flooping lucky. I had saved an eBay search for the graphic novel, and one morning, just when I was about to go into work, I got a notification. A new copy of Frank was listed for $7 and $11 shipping. Less than $20 total. I bought it immediately, cackling like a madman. I thought for sure that the copy would be like super worn, or it would have its spine cracked open, or it would be water damaged or something. But no. Other than some light reading scratches, like someone ran their fingernail over the cover, the book is in great shape. I think that whoever sold this just didn't know what they were selling. And now, I'm going to share it with y'all. My name is Ben, and this is Comic Book Breakdown, episode 19.19. The Punisher, A Man Named Frank. The story doesn't waste any time getting things going. When we crack open this baby, it's December 23rd in the year 1910, and Frank's children are already dead. His wife, Maria, screams from their house, and Frank himself is tied to a wagon wheel, his shirt torn away, his torso bleeding, nicked and sliced by a knife. 3 men surround him, smiling, enjoying this. Maria's screams finally stop, and a 4th man joins the others. His face is hidden by the shadow of a hat. Exhausted from the pain, wounded emotionally and physically, Frank stares at the men. He commits each of their faces to memory. He'll need to remember everything that he can about them if he's going to kill them. The 4th man holds up a tin box. This is the only thing of value that he's found. He opens it up, and his compadres are amazed. Diamonds! They're going to be rich! But the 4th man snorts. Not hardly. These ain't diamonds. They're rock candy. Worthless, unless you got as powerful a sweet tooth as him. He pops one into his mouth. The 3 men say that he, meaning Frank, hasn't told them anything despite their attempts to encourage him. The 4th man leans in, looking into Frank's eyes. Frank glares back, his mouth an angry snarl. His eyes lock on the crucifix around the man's neck, the one that he gifted to Maria. No, the 4th man replies, you won't ever get anything out of him. He ain't a farmer. This here man's a killer, ain't ya? The men leave Frank barely alive to let him suffer. He's lost his wife and kids after all, and he will never find them after this. Letting him live is the worst thing that they could do to him. The 4 men mount their horses and ride off to the south. Their mistake. Fueled by anger and hate, Frank found his way to his feet, lifting the wagon wheel that he was tied to. The leather used to tie him around it sawed into his arms, ate through his flesh, but he didn't care. Finding his feet, he starts walking. It's 20 miles to the nearest neighbor, the Baxters, and he has got to try. The knife wounds, the blood loss from his arms, the sheer exertion of the walk, and maintaining his equilibrium with that wheel spreading his arms out, plus the emotional damage, plus the heat of the day and the high sun and no food and no water, all of it finally adds up. Frank was never sure of how far he walked before he fell, but he finally did, collapsing into the dirt. After a time, a wagon happened to pass by. Its passengers were a pastor and some nuns, and they collected Frank's body. A dust storm eventually forced them to stop for rest in a cave, and after some much-needed rest and water, that's when Frank wakes up. He chats with the priest in the cave, desperate to get back to his family, and while they talk, he is scanning the cave walls. Rock paintings depict several stick figures, and one of them has a white skull for a head. That image seems to stick with Frank. The priest, named Father Domingo, and the sisters help Frank bury his family after the storm has passed. They promise to pray for their souls, including Frank's, but he doesn't need it. He knows the road that he's on now, and he knows where it'll take him. After they leave, Frank goes to the stone wall surrounding his property. Using a shovel, he removes some of the stones, uncovering a hidden lockbox. Inside of it is a 6-shooter and a bunch of gold coins. It takes him almost a month of travel, but Frank finally finds an old friend, a man named Augustus, at the bottom of a bottle in a bar. They served together in the war, killing the Spanish, and conversational clues indicate that they served under Colonel Roosevelt. For those of you unfamiliar with American history, this means they fought in the Spanish-American War in 1898. Roosevelt formed and led a group of fighters called the Rough Riders, and they fought in Cuba against the Spanish, meaning people from Spain, in this instance, military. Classically in the Marvel Universe, Frank Castle is a former soldier, and Dixon keeps that story beat, adapting it to the time period. So far, there's been very little change about Frank's story. His family gets killed, he goes on a murder spree. That's basically the same thing as what happens in the Punisher's original story. That's classic, it's timeless. Tale as old as time, you might say. But some of the adaptations done to make the story fit the time period do bother me. In the Punisher's classic origin, his family was having a picnic and they were killed in a shootout between rival crime families. He then embarks in a war against crime, as he doesn't know who killed his family specifically, so he just has to kill everyone. But this story has Frank's family murdered by thieves. Thieves who tortured Frank in order to get at his money. Money that we are shown that Frank has in the end. This means that these dudes showed up, tried to rob Frank, and when he fought back, they beat him, tortured him, and questioned him. Then they moved on to killing his kids and even his wife. So why didn't he just give them the flooping money? When Frank removes the gold from the fence, it's clearly been put there as rainy day money, something difficult to get to so that it doesn't get used. This idea is reinforced by having his gun there. It's meant to imply to us that he has moved on from his life as a soldier and a killer, and that he's put it behind him. This also indicates that his family has been getting by without that gold. It doesn't mean anything to them. They don't need it. So give them the
no swearing
gold, Frank. His family might still be alive if he'd given it up. And admittedly, sure, maybe these 4 men would have killed his kids and wife anyways, but that would just make his story all the more tragic, and make the bad guys look like even worse people. It would be a story-enhancing move, people, come on! By having Frank not give up the gold, it makes it seem like the gold is worth more to Frank than his family, that maybe he actually wanted a reason to punish some people, to hunt them down, to kill them. And this opening certainly plays with the idea that Frank is a killer down to his core. The 4th man says that he can see it in his eyes. I would argue that Dixon does play with some elements of that later on in the story that hint at Frank's desire to just kill, but that's also generally not a part of Frank's character that his stories like to tell. Frank's actions are always portrayed as heroic, the punishing of someone who has done something wrong, not the desire of a man to kill no matter how he has to justify it. It's kind of hard to enjoy a revenge story when you think that the lead character let his family get killed so that he could then go around revenge murdering people, One of the adaptations that I do like is that it is implied that Frank's wife, Maria, is Spanish. Classically, Maria is a blonde woman, and in defense of the classic continuity, the body of their dead daughter that we are shown is blonde. But Maria is also a common name in Spanish cultures, and Frank uses a lot of casual Spanish in his inner monologue. Specifically, he refers to her crucifix as a crucifijillo. Why would he do that unless he or Maria were Spanish? So I like the idea of Maria being ethnically Spanish, but we are presented with uneven evidence about that in the story and the art. So take it how you personally like it. I like the idea that she's Spanish as it helps fit the setting a little bit better, but it's not like it changes our narrative overall. So Frank visits Gus and drops his gold on a pile of weapons. Like, we're talking so many weapons that he needs a second horse just to carry it all. Now, he is ready to kill some mans. He just needs to find them. We next find Frank in 1912, roughly 2 years and 3 months since the day his family died. One of the men he's hunting is a blonde that has a stoved-in nose, and after asking around, he finally has a name. Billy Sims. That's what's brought him to Denver. He goes into a local saloon, his black shirt has a white skull emblazoned on it, and he kills Billy, and the 4 men defending him. The attack draws the attention of the local sheriff, a round, bespectacled man who finds Frank searching Billy's body. He collects a piece of paper from the dead man's pocket and then talks to the sheriff. He has wanted papers for Billy Sims from New Mexico and Arizona, and he's confident that the rest of the men that he killed probably have warrants too. The sheriff checks Frank's papers. So he's a bounty hunter, huh? He doesn't much like somebody else hunting in his jurisdiction. This isn't some lawless cow town. This is the 20th century, for God's sake. He hands Frank back his papers. Don't you think I want credit for this? The sheriff asks. Frank says that he shouldn't. After all, quote, he has the whole 20th century to protect. Right up to the city limits, end quote. And then Frank moves on. The attack on Sims is nothing terribly special. There was this weird moment when Frank pulls out what looks to me like a modern-day handgun. He's got a 6-shooter in one hand and a flooping pistol in the other. But a quick search for 1912 guns in Google taught me that there was indeed a very modern-looking gun manufactured called the M1911. So the comic isn't wrong, I'm just uneducated on my gun history, which doesn't surprise me. The scene with the sheriff is quite enjoyable, though. One of the things that the Punisher is meant to criticize as a concept is the failure of law enforcement. That the inability of the police to stop crimes leads to death like those that Frank's suffered, and forces Frank's hand. This sheriff wants credit for stopping the criminal Billy Sims, but he did nothing to catch him that we can see. Billy and his men are casually playing cards in the saloon, they are relaxed and calm. They don't exactly feel like men who are being hunted by the law, you know? So if this guy wants credit, then maybe he should do the flooping work. There is also a jab at him in the form of his jurisdiction. This man is only responsible for policing Denver, and that allows bad things to happen everywhere else. Frank has crossed multiple state lines in order to hunt the men who wronged him. From his perspective, he is doing what must be done in order to see justice brought to these men. Meanwhile, the sheriff is only concerned with his corner of the world. Again, the Punisher goes where the police can't. But there's one final thing that I really like about this, that 20th century comment. The sheriff is arguing that the world is more civilized, that this kind of behavior that Frank is engaging in, shooting men dead in the street, that's something that's been left behind. Frank's reply ties into that idea, that the world has moved past this kind of thing to this jurisdiction idea. The sheriff polices the 20th century in the 20th century way, ineffectively. The Punisher polices everything else, including men who behave in primitive ways, and he gets the job done. Primitively. That night, Frank reads through the letter that he confiscated. It's from someone signed S, down in Texas. A rancher needs hired guns, and the author suggests that Billy take up the job. With no other leads to follow, Frank heads south to the farm of Angus McCulley. Once there, he meets Tuck Jurgensen. Jurgensen runs security for the southern portion of McCulley's lands. He's looking to hire a man to do the same for the north. He takes Frank inside the ranch house and introduces him to McCulley. He asks after Frank's credentials, and we get a little bit of his history. Fought in Cuba in '98. He was not a Rough Rider, just so we're clear, although he did meet President Roosevelt once. He's served as an officer of the courts for Santa Fe and Phoenix, reflecting the work that he did as a bounty hunter. McCulley explains that someone is stealing his cattle. That's why he needs the extra man. But he doesn't want these men discouraged, he says. He wants them punished. Can Frank do that? With dead eyes, Frank looks at McCulley and into the camera. I'll do my damnedest. And so begins the next strangest period of the story. Frank does his job. He rides the northern end of McCulley's lands, policing them, and he does indeed find cattle rustlers. He kills them, too. Frank constantly introduces himself to the other farmhands and cowhands that are brought onto McCulley's property, hoping to find the S that sent the letter to Billy Sims, but he has no luck. The other men don't really like Frank. They're standoffish and skittish. They're nervous around him. Like a horse around wild deer, he muses. Or, how a dog behaves around a wolf. Dixon is telling us that Frank is wild and untamed, more primal than other people are, feeding us this belief that the Punisher is somehow more pure, more natural, and thus more right in his actions. This effort is futile until Frank encounters the Dunn brothers. He kills one of them and runs the other down, pinning him under his horse after Frank kills it. A nervous wreck, Dunn complains that the Mexes, meaning Mexicans, are allowed to steal McCulley's cattle. Why can't he? Everyone knows it. This interests Frank, and he kills the man, saying that he's worth $500. It's McCulley's going rate for each man punished. Frank then begins to ask around. He goes to the nearest town and buys some drinks for the locals, loosening up some lips. He learns that some of McCulley's cattle are indeed sent to Mexico, and he learns of the location where that happens. Frank investigates the area, finding cattle prints that confirm that cattle do indeed pass through here, at the very least. The beef industry isn't doing too good in America, he says, and hard times in America are even harder in Mexico. So there's no reason he can think of that McCulley would send his cattle there. Frank camps atop a nearby mesa and watches the scene. For a week. Finally, though, it happens late at night. Jurgensen bosses around his own complement of farmhands who are directing the cattle. A contingent of Mexicans come up from the south. Whether they're revolutionaries or insurgents, Frank doesn't know. It depends on which newspaper you read. But he still watches, and amongst the Mexicans, he sees two of the men that he is hunting, who he refers to as the Breed and the Sow Eyes. He also sees Jurgensen receive payment, a saddlebag filled with either cash or gold, he doesn't know. When Jurgensen and his party leave, Frank follows the Mexicans south. He watches them camp along the railway and, familiar with the terrain, the railroads, and the time it would take to move the cattle onto the train, he comes up with a plan. After the cattle are loaded up onto the train, it moves on. It reaches a portion of the railroad that is held aloft by trestles, wooden supports. Frank uses his rifle to shoot the dynamite that he wedged into the supports, blowing them. A second explosion cuts the train off from behind, leaving it stuck. Wherever that load of cattle was going, it ain't getting there now. The Mexicans climb to the roof of the train cars looking for their attacker. That was what Frank wanted. He could have just blown the tracks and sent the whole train into the ravine, but he only wants two of the people on that train dead. When the Breed and Pig Eyes climb onto the roof, he shoots them both. Doing so gives away his position, though, and the Mexicans start to return fire. He escapes, grabbing his horse, and books it as fast as he can. Those Mexicans don't appear to be a forgiving bunch. He needs to get back to McCulley's, now. By the time Frank gets there, it's night. McCulley is enjoying dinner when Frank interrupts, delivering news about Jurgensen's double dipping. McCulley sits back in his chair, wiping at his mouth with a napkin. That is some shocking news, isn't it, Mr. Jurgensen? Tuck Jurgensen stands behind Frank, his pistol drawn. Yes, quite shocking. McCulley does his big villain speech now. He is the mastermind behind all of this. Trade with the Mexicans is restricted, as the U.S. government does not want to support the revolutionaries. So, McCulley sells his cattle to General Zuvalo for gold coin, and then writes off the missing cattle. And from the way he's talking, I'm guessing that the cattle are insured? So then he gets paid back by the government, otherwise I don't think that he would make enough money to make this worth it. Frank straight up tells us that the beef market is struggling right now, and that if things are bad in the States, then they're worse in Mexico, so I can see McCulley selling to Zuvalo to make money, but if things are worse in Mexico, then he couldn't be paying full price, right? Playing this as an insurance scam is the only way that I can see for McCulley to come out ahead on this. Anyway, McCulley is sad that Frank learned about this. He likes Frank. He's done good work. But he also seems like the kind of man with morals. The kind of man who would never be okay with this plan. A pity. How about a drink before you die, Frank? Jurgensen actually has the balls to hold up a finger. You know what? He wouldn't mind a drink. Something to cut through the dust of that trail. And if Mr. McCulley could just throw in a small piece of rock candy, Jurgensen would appreciate it. He has a powerful sweet tooth. Frank's eyes narrow. He glances at Jurgensen, knowing what he'll see before he even finishes. Hanging around the man's neck is a cross. Maria's crucifix. A commotion outside catches Jurgensen and McCulley's attention. It sounds like riders. Oh, right, Frank says casually. I wasn't aware of your situation, sir, so I took it upon myself to intervene. That's probably the Mexicans come to protest your sudden betrayal. Outside, we see one of the writers, a woman, light a pack of dynamite and hurl it. As Frank finishes his sentence, the wall explodes, scattering the men. A better distraction? Frank couldn't have asked for. He runs off for his guns. As he reaches them, the riders are circling the building. Frank leaps over his horse, drawing a shotgun from the saddle as he does so. He lands and fires, killing the immediate threats to his safety. As he does, his narration comments that the man who sold him his horse laughed at him when he bought a deaf horse. Sure is coming handy in a gunfight, though. Having bought himself a moment, Frank draws a Lewis gun from his second horse. A Lewis gun is a light machine gun where a wheel of ammo is attached on top of the rifle, allowing for rapid fire. They were originally designed in 1911, but the manufacturer had no luck getting a contract in the United States, actually. He had to go to Belgium in order to find success, so I don't know how Frank would have had access to one of these guns, but again, if you don't do the research, you wouldn't know about any of that, and maybe Dixon was counting on that. Anyways, Frank opens fire and mows down the Mexicans. He doesn't have anything against them, not really. They're just between him and the man that he wants to kill. While he's busy doing that, McCulley and Jurgensen fire off pot shots inside the house. As the crowd thins, thanks to Frank's work, they have a moment to grab the gold and prepare to run. They can have the damn farm, as far as McCulley is concerned. But as they go to leave, the Mexican woman enters the house. Using a whip, she snaps McCulley in the face, and he opens fire with his shotgun. The blast tears through the woman and the man next to her, and it catches Jurgensen in his arm. He falls to the ground in pain. McCulley runs, not giving him a second thought. He runs outside to his car and takes off. We see the Mexicans, who are still being fired upon by Frank, peel off and follow McCulley. Maybe they'll have better luck with him. That's fine by Frank, though. He is here for only one man, after all. Jurgensen walks outside, nursing his arm. Has Frank killed his fill yet? He asks, looking at all of the bodies. Frank doesn't answer. Instead, he says that he came here looking for a man who wrote to Billy Sims. Name of S. Jurgensen sighs. Stands for Swede. That's what Billy called him. He gestures at his arm. Yeah, he can't really put up a fair fight, suggesting that they can't have a standoff like this. Frank sneers. He wasn't planning on a fair fight. He draws, fires, and kills the man. Then he collects the crucifix and goes home. Having avenged his family, Frank returns to their graves. Father Domingo is with him, hat in hand, and we learn that the father and nuns planted flowers at the graves. And they did pray. Frank appreciates it, all of it. He places the chain of the crucifix over the wood of Maria's grave marker, and he leaves. He will never go home again. We then jump to New York City. McCulley escaped the Mexicans who were chasing him, and he has set up quite nicely in the city. We find him wearing a nice suit, smoking cigars, and telling stories to the city's rich and elite. They've heard that he's booked passage to Europe, despite the rumors of brewing war. Well, he scoffs, maybe that's what he needs. He's already conquered the American frontier, and city life is just so boring for him now. Maybe a war is what he needs to pick him up. A waiter comes over and whispers into his ear, "Sir, there is a man here for you." Confident that this is the man from the steamer company come to pick him up, McCulley is horrified to find Frank instead. With no warning, no words, and no mercy, Frank shoots McCulley once, killing him, and leaves. The only option left to him now is to stick to the trail that he's made, that of killing, and to punish all trespassers. My first thought upon finishing A Man Named Frank is that I am glad I didn't pay a lot of money for it. It isn't bad. This is a well-executed comic, but for my individual tastes, there is just not enough depth here, and there is nothing new. There's nothing special. Artist John Buscema does a solid job on this comic. His pages flow well, the whole comic is understandable, his backgrounds are varied and accurate, as far as I know about the American West anyways, and I gotta say, his Frank Castle is the best. When I think of the Punisher, this is the physical depiction that I see in my head. Buscema's Frank is built like a no swearing brick house. He is tall, he is wide, he is muscular, but he's also lithe and graceful. You get a lot of shots of Frank leaping over a horse or bent over firing that Lewis gun as he mows down Mexicans or other forms of gun combat. There is an amazing degree of flexibility in the artwork to be able to show Frank as someone who is physically unmoving in one sense or lithe as a panther in the next. You also get a lot of shots of Frank standing tall as an obelisk, just unmoving, only his gun sticking out as he shoots someone, and it works visually. Buscema does a great job. And in terms of faces, again, Buscema nails it. His version of Frank is square-jawed with either a beard or rough stubble hugging his face. His eyes are hard squares, just as set and haunted as he is. He has high cheekbones, which I did not expect to work, but they work here, highlighting Frank's own skull, making him look a little bit more like death come to life. But he also has a small curl of black hair hanging in his face, almost like the old Superman curl. And as un-Superman-like as the Punisher is in how he deals with his enemies, there is something that I really like about it. It lends an air to Frank that makes him stand out a little bit more. It gives him an unearned and unworked level of handsomeness, which fits his personality. Frank isn't someone who's going to take a while to make sure he looks right before he shoots you, but he still has to be a handsome enough guy that he got married and he had kids. He has to look good. I also like this idea because Superman is a super strong character. Like, he can be unmovable if he does not want to be moved, you know what I mean? And so is Frank. Nothing will change his course, and no one will stop him. The rest of the cast is well rendered artistically, again, with differing faces and body types. As a personal challenge, I tried to memorize the three men at the start of the comic, the ones who were torturing Frank, to see if I could keep them in my mind as the years of the comic passed as I read. I honestly couldn't, despite their unique faces. They are just that perfect blend of individualized, where they all look unique, but bland, because they're all unnotable background characters. How Frank managed to remember their faces over the course of 12 years, I will never know, because I had forgotten in 12 seconds. The coloring for this comic was done by Christie Scheele, with color separation by Comic Color, and you can definitely tell that this book was digitally colored in an age when digitally coloring was new. I'm kind of surprised that it was, as this was published in '94, and digital coloring was pretty new to Marvel Comics at the time. You can find a lot of, I hesitate to say ugly, but that might be the best term for it. You find a lot of not great looking comics in the 90s, thanks to the new technology of digital coloring. Yeah, I'm looking at you, Two Gun Kid and the Sunset Riders. But Scheele does a pretty solid job on this book. The book is a lot of oranges, browns, grays, all of which fit the era and the setting. It does lack the polish and artistry of modern work, though, like we got from Menon and Rosenberg. So where that particular comic, 2019's Gunhawks, looks amazing from a coloring perspective, this book looks fine. And given the 20 years of advancement in digital coloring technology and skills of usage, I think that's pretty understandable. My biggest complaint with the book, from a coloring perspective, is that there are a lot of Mexicans in this comic, and they are all colored in this drab gray skin tone. They look like the living dead, not people, and it is clearly an attempt to color them something other than white, but it fails, pretty much utterly. On the plus side, the cover for this book is a beautiful painted cover by Bob Larkin. It's got Frank wearing his black and skull shirt on the cover with a pair of jeans on. He's got 6-shooter spitting fire in one hand and a sawed-off shotgun in the other. He's sneering, he's got a cowboy hat on his head, there are dead men at his feet with cacti, mesas, and the setting sun behind him. The cover is mostly orange, the color of the setting sun, and that's great. The bright orange could easily catch someone's eye if this was sitting on a shelf, cover facing out, but the bright colors also contrast nicely with the darker shades of Frank's body. Larkin's painting overall is detailed and it is well rendered. I've seen his work before in a few of the Marvel card sets that I've collected, and he does solid work every time. The image is so nice that the title font almost seems unnecessary to me. Like, it feels totally detached from the rest of the image. But, I mean, the cover sells the idea easily. It's the Punisher, but make it cowboy, and I gotta say, that works. In terms of the writing, author Chuck Dixon writes the hell out of this character. Frank narrates the entire issue, and we spend the whole time in his head. There is no question about what Frank is going to do, like we had with the Kid Colt one-shot, nor is there any secondary character narrating in order to add distance between us and Frank's mind, like we had in Apache Skies or Kid Colt. With this book, it is all Frank, all time. It is a man named Frank, all the time. That narrow field of focus is pretty spot on for the character, and again, I think that makes sense, as Dixon wrote Frank quite a bit at the time. He understands the character, and I think that he does portray him well. After the death of his family, Frank is relentless and driven, much like the modern Punisher. When his quest takes him years, he never once falters. He never thinks about quitting. When all he has to go on is an S scratched onto a piece of paper, he finds that S. That is totally the Punisher, and it works. There are some odd bits and pieces for me. Frank tells us that he spent some time as a lawman, then as a bounty hunter, and a few times he talks about the money that he has made. When he's gunning down the Mexicans at the end, there's actually a line about how much ammunition he is using and how none of the Mexicans are going to have bounties on them, so he can't even turn a profit by killing them. On the one hand, I absolutely hate this. A Punisher who is motivated by money is not the Punisher. There's a purity to the Punisher's mission, right? Where even if I disagree with him about killing people, I do appreciate his focus. I appreciate his vision. He kills killers and criminals, period, for no reason other than that they don't deserve to live. Adding in the idea that he is doing it for money, I mean, that just makes him your standard issue bounty hunter. He's not the Punisher anymore. He's just a man looking for cash. He's Boba Fett in a skull costume. That said, the reality of the situation is that Frank still needs to eat and feed his horses, buy ammunition, wear clothes. I mean, he is still a human being, and that means needing money to operate in society. So him working for the law or acting as a bounty hunter does make a lot of sense for his particular set of skills and abilities. Countering that, though, making the Punisher concerned with stuff like clothing, the care of his horses, and food makes him feel more human, more normal. And normal people don't go on a decade-long killing spree in the name of their dead family without losing some steam, without forgetting or moving on or quitting. And if Frank did that, then he wouldn't be the Punisher. So these moments bother me, and however much I try to justify them within the world of the story, they still bother me. Overall, I'll admit it, the story works fine. Frank still feels like Frank for 99% of this comic, and like, if you are a diehard Punisher fan, I think you would be fine. You probably don't care how I feel about the Punisher. I'm clearly of mixed thoughts on this one, because on the one hand, I like Frank's intensity and his tenacity and his focus, but I absolutely hate this weird killing for money thing that he has going on simultaneously. To Dixon's credit, I do really enjoy that he plays with the idea that Frank kills because he wants to, even if it doesn't fit within his personal mission. I mean, just look at his work for Macaulay. Macaulay is not a man who represents the law. He is not a government official. He's just a landowner. Him asking Frank to punish the cattle rustlers, and Frank choosing to do so by outright killing them all, is illegal. That's just good old murder. And Frank does it anyway. And honestly, while Macaulay was willing to kill Frank, he didn't wrong him. The Mexican showed up before Macaulay could do anything, and then he escaped, and yet Frank hunted him down and killed him anyway. Why? What did Macaulay do to warrant being killed? He ripped off the American government, maybe? He was selling cattle to the Mexicans? He betrayed Frank's trust? Employed the one dude left who had wronged him? There's no good reason for Frank to hunt Macaulay all the way to New York City and then kill him, other than Frank just not liking the man and what he did, and Frank's own desire to kill. Dixon doesn't condemn this part of Frank in the story. He doesn't show it as being a bad thing. Frank is portrayed as a hero throughout, even if his actions aren't heroic. They're unhinged. And that's ultimately why I'm glad I didn't spend a lot of money on this book. For me to root for the Punisher, he has to be laser focused and only punish those who deserve it. But in this comic, Frank kills horses, cattle rustlers, and no swearing, ton of Mexican insurgents in the name of his revenge, and none of them were deserving. And if you want to argue with me that the cattle rustlers were stealing and that they deserved punishment, sure, I can agree to that. Stealing is illegal, but that doesn't mean that they should have been killed. So this is a bit of a mixed bag for me. I don't think this is a badly written Frank. Again, when you're reading the book and you're in the character's headspace, like, it feels right and it works. But I do think that this is a very uneven written Frank in terms of who the Punisher is and what he stands for. This is a small personal note, but I do love that Frank is not ever called the Punisher in the comic. Like, he never renames himself, even if he does make the punishing of people his life's mission. And we're never given a last name for him either. No one actually calls him Frank Castle, his name in the normal Punisher comics. He's just Frank. He's just a man named Frank. And I have to admit that I kind of love that. Next time, we're closing out our Western stories with a look back. I went into this set of episodes and these books wondering what was it about Westerns that made people want them? What answers did I find? What have we learned at the end of all of this? Join me in a week for Comic Book Breakdown episode 19.20, Circling the Wagons. Everyone, there are a million podcasts vying for your time and attention, and I'd like to thank you for listening to mine. If you would like to get in touch with me to share a concern, request a series, compliment me, berate me, whatever you like, send me an email at cbbreakdown@gmail.com. Otherwise, thanks for listening.